I'm gonna try to make I'm going to try to make this as interactive as possible. So, feel free to use the chat or unmute yourself. And really, I want to make this more of a conversation than just me kind of talking at you at this late hour. But my name is Tracy Beard. I am the Coalition Coordinator for Housing for All Tennessee. And a bunch of you might already know each other, but I just want to kind of get a sense of like, since I'm kind of new to the group, um, how many of you already done any kind of advocacy work before on campus or in the community or legislature? And if you want to, you could just pop a word or two in the chat or raise your hand or unmute yourself to kind of say like if you've done any of that work before. Yeah. So quite a few of you have done some of that work before, and so tonight I'm going to sort of talk about housing for all Tennessee, what our day on the Hill is, and what it will look like, and kind of some really, when I say very, very elementary, basic practical tips for talking to legislators. And so that's kind of like what we're going to do. And then we're going to mainly kind of just spend most of our time kind of checking in and seeing, kind of talking about some of the hangups or things that you might have. Or questions that you might have when sort of talking to legislators or the work that we do for Day on the Hill. So, a little bit about Housing for All Tennessee. So, Housing for All Tennessee, we are a really new coalition. We're less than a year old, and we're a statewide coalition of on the ground organizations and partners, and we're really focused on affordable housing, tenants' rights, and ending homelessness in Tennessee. And our coalition includes people with lived experiences of housing instability and homelessness, service providers, legal advocates, organizers, and now you, increasingly like medical students and folks in the healthcare field that deal with the impacts of lack of housing and housing instability with your patients every day. And so I'm kind of curious in your community work, clinical work, and I know that some of you are like in various stages of like your programs. Um, what sort of like some of the ways that housing kind of impacts health and care, or like some of the things that you've experienced when working with folks who are experiencing homelessness? What are some of the things that you kind of come across um, that pertains to sort of lack of housing? And you can just drop it in the chat or, unmute yourself.
Wait, sorry, Tracy, could you re-ask the question?
Yeah. So like what are some of the things that you commonly see? Like,
Oh,
because what I really want to like have us start to talk about, or when we start to kind of look at, is sort of the connection between health and the lack of housing, and how the lack of housing is a one of the determinants of like, poor health outcomes. And have us sort of kind of really talk through some of those things. So issues treating frostbite, where patient has no way to stay warm, right? Like high rent, lack of IDs, poor hygiene, difficulty with transportation to appointments, storage of medications. Yeah. So what we're seeing, dilapidated housing, housing being available, but no trust in the system from our clients. So all of the things that you're seeing on the ground when you're treating patients are all of the systematic issues that we're trying to address when we are looking at creating policies and things for Day on the Hill. And so when we're looking at talking about Day on the Hill. It's really our annual event. This will be the fourth year that we're doing this in Nashville. And so our purpose is to bring together people with lived experiences, their families, coalition members, concerned citizens to talk about these specific issues and the things that you see on the ground, and how that impacts policies, but more importantly, to educate legislators and have them push for policies that will make housing accessible for everyone, and also um, have Tennesseans or, or any place that folks might be, um, to have healthier lives. And I just kind of want to know, like, are most of the folks here, are you from other places? Are you in Tennessee?
So I actually, because we force people to register, and we get their schools for a lot of people. So I think we have people from around 10, maybe 11 different states. And we also had some
Mhm.
people register who were from Puerto Rico. So yeah, we have a whole collection, but we definitely do also have some Tennessee folks here as well.
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about might be Tennessee specific, but housing issues is global, right? So we've got somebody from the Czech Republic, right? We've got Pennsylvania, Michigan, Texas, Puerto Rico, San Antonio, Chicago. And so all of these issues, even though we are talking about Tennessee and some of the things that are happening in Tennessee, I really want for some of us who may be in different areas or different parts of the country or the world to really think about these issues and how to talk to your sort of local legislators, no matter where you are. Um, and sort of kind of like how you might be able to advocate. And so this is just one particular way that you can advocate, and also like in Tennessee. So hopefully this might also be something that um, feels useful even if you're not in Tennessee. And so for us, our day on the Hill is we usually convene on 2 days. So, like the night before, we usually have a small dinner. And this year, we'll have it at the Trinity Community Commons, which is a local nonprofit and gathering space in East Nashville in Nashville, Tennessee. And then our day on the Hill, where we actually meet with legislators, is going to be on February 24th. Just to kind of give you guys some dates on that. And then just to make sure, can you guys like make sure I'm on a good time check for everything? Okay, good. And so the purpose of having Day on the Hill, or why we do the things that we are doing, is one, we have kind of like our five big goals. We really want to advocate for policies and decisions that really can have a positive impact on the lives of the folks that we are organizing around. And so we also want to equip attendees, no matter who they are within their walk of life, to speak confidently about policy priorities. We really are about building relationships and fostering ongoing communication with legislators. And then we're providing education, not only to the lawmakers, but the folks who are most, impacted, are also like teaching us about like their lived experiences, and then also concerned citizens and people who just really care about these issues around housing, getting some understanding and education around that. And then we're building community and really trying to develop or amplify like people's individual stories into a public narrative. And so those are some of the things that we are really trying to do with our day on the Hill. And with that is sort of thinking about like how do we actually talk to legislators and and what your role is as an advocate. So, the most important thing that I would want folks to know is that you are representing yourself as either a concerned citizen, or maybe you might be a person that might have lived experience. What's really important, particularly in the US, or from other spaces, we do have particular laws around nonprofits and different organizations around that prohibit lobbying. So you really want to make sure that you're saying you're representing yourself, and not the school or institution or nonprofit, unless that nonprofit has a particular designation around lobbying. But most nonprofits are a 501(c)(3), and they're prohibited from lobbying. That's why we're really being careful about saying, like, we're not lobbying policymakers, we're educating them, we're telling our stories, we're sharing our experiences. And so I also want you to know that you are the expert in your experiences. Whether you're a person with lived experiences or a medical student, or however you are actually the expert in that. You help people every day, to to try to stay as healthy as they can in the most undignified circumstances. And so your experiences and what you have is very, very powerful. Um, and so some of the things that we would need to do to prepare yourself before you go and speak to a legislator is, one, sort of know who the legislators are. And uh, with our day on the Hill, we really try to prepare folks on who their legislators are. If you are in Tennessee and you are a resident and a registered voter, you can find out who your legislator might be, your state senator or your state representative. Also, in other states, you should be able to find that information as well. You can also use and it's the link that's also in the chat, the capital.tn.gov, to also research the committees that your legislators might be on, or particular House committees that might be looking at specific bills that will pertain to the things that you're interested in around housing or health. And then when you're going to talk to legislators, it's really important to, if you don't already have like specific bills, and right now, Housing for All Tennessee, we're in the process of kind of teasing through the particular policies that we're going to be presenting to legislators for Day on the Hill in February. So we're kind of finishing up and polishing that work. So I don't necessarily have a refined policies that I could give you now. But some of those things that we are definitely looking at, particularly around tenants' rights, would be requiring that landlords include air conditioning as a part of maintenance for utilities. Right now, they only require heating. But if you live in the South, you know that we need air conditioning. And so, and the impacts of sort of heat stroke and things of that nature can have like really disastrous effects, or really dangerous effects on that. Also, things like making sure that folks have IDs who are unhoused, so they could be able to get documentation to apply for housing and the other things that they need. And so you really want to, there's a plethora of issues that you could talk about, but you really want to limit your topic and focus on one topic, and maybe write down 2 or 3 key points to discuss, and then practice, 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 practice. The meetings can be short, sometimes from 5 to 15 minutes. So you really would have to get your ideas down in a succinct way, so you could get your message across. And so a little bit about um, sort of sharing your story. Um, when we think about sharing your story, and really look at that, I really want to encourage folks to really think about sort of like what the structure of when you're in the meeting room with legislators, kind of like this sort of three part structure of sharing your story. The first thing you want to do is introduce yourself and let them know who you are. If you're from their district, so if you're a registered voter in their district, or if you work in their district, and the issue that you want to discuss. And then you want to also talk about your personal story around this. And you don't have to be an expert on policy, and your perspective on how housing issues sort of affects the community, sort of the health outcomes, and from your lived experience will be really powerful. And then you want to say why this issue matters to the community that they serve. And so when you kind of create that story or narrative in that way, it really allows for folks to understand why the issue is not just important, but important to their community and their constituents. And so, um, I want you to sort of think about this, and you don't have to share, but if you were going to share a story, would it be your own experience? If it's not your experience, would it be an experience that you had with a patient or a community member? Make sure that you don't tell any personal or identifying information. Just like with anything, we want to de-identify information. And also, if you notice any patterns, right? Because we don't have lack of shelter in the winter, I'm seeing a lot of patients that are experiencing frostbite, right? And so the reason why we need to have XYZ bill is because that will allow for folks to be sheltered in the winter, and then we'll have lower impacts of frostbite, and that could also lead to lower emergency room, you know, visits and things of that nature. And so if you're going to think about that, think about like how you would put that in, um, put that into a story that you would share. And I'm going to pause for a second. Does anybody have any questions about this, um, or have any sort of, you know, any questions? Okay, we're good. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and move a little bit forward. And so I think the other part of it is sometimes when we're talking to legislators, and especially if it's a legislator that is not aligned with the things that you believe, that has in the past or currently voted against some of the measures that would be protective of folks, it's, you know, it might be really difficult to have these conversations with them. But it's really, really important that you know, when you go to meet with legislators, that you're really courteous to the staff and the legislators, that you're clear and you're honest, and that you're open to having conversation and dialogue. What we don't do is we don't debate or give ultimatums. In that space, it rarely works well. If it does, if it usually doesn't work well or pan out very well. And you also have to respect their right to disagree. Um, and it's really important to use plain everyday language and try not to use jargon or acronyms. Or if you do have to use something that's like jargon or acronyms, you explain what it is. And be patient if they make a mistake. And always, always remember you are the expert on your experience. And so, in what you've seen and the patients that you've treated. So, there's no need to feel um, sort of I guess, insecure about that. And then after the meeting, because we're building ongoing relationships, you want to thank their staff. You want to follow up with a thank you note or email. And in that thank you note and email, you want to remind them of your main points. And if you to have a photo, that you took, include that in that as well. The goal for Day on the Hill or any type of advocacy is really developing personal relationships with elected representatives. And that's to really have more long-term influence on housing and health issues. And every conversation that you have builds on one another. And so it's really important that after the meeting, that you kind of do some follow up with that. And then I'm going to pause. Is there anything that you have questions about or you want to sort of speak to a little bit more deeply?
I know I have a question, Tracy. What are
Mhm.
common questions that legislators frequent, frequently will ask? Like if I came to speak to them about a certain policy or a certain bill, like what are questions that they might ask me that I should probably
Yeah,
have answers to?
yeah. So it might be, for example, if you're coming to like Day on the Hill with us, we usually give you like a policy brief or some information about that policy. So some of the things might be, you know, it might be asking you data of like, who does this, bill mostly impact? Who's the community that it impacts? Do you know maybe how many folks that you serve in my community that have these particular issues? Some of these things, and I want to stress upon you, like you don't have to know all of the answers right away. And some of it are things that you could say, like, I may not know the answer to that. So, and I'll give you a very specific example because we talked about this, Sophia. So, you might be asked like what the fiscal note is. So, a lot of the bills that are presented have a cost to it. Some of the bills don't have any cost or minimum cost, and some of them do. If you're asked something like a fiscal note, you could just say, I don't know what the fiscal note might be. That's something that your staff might be able to research. But what I can tell you is that we need this bill to pass because it's important for the health and safety of your constituents. But it would be good for you to do a little bit of research on what the bill is and why it's important. And be able to also have like the House number or the Senate number, the very specific information about the bill that you're wanting to have addressed. I hope that answered your question, or at least a part of it.
Yeah, it did. Thank you. I think the other question they asked me when I went to Dan Hill was what other states have implemented a policy or this policy and then what happened next. And so I think that was just we got asked that by a few legislators. I think that was helpful to have research prior. Um, but yeah, no, thank you so much, Tracy. That was really helpful.
Yeah. And so some of that might be depending upon like how deep you're into the advocacy work, you may want to have like certain examples. But if you're, unsure, it's always okay to say that you don't know or that you're unsure because the one thing you don't want to do is mislead a legislator or say something that you don't know or that is not definitive. Um, are there any other questions? And it might also be helpful to know or do a little bit of research on like what that particular legislature has or representative has voted on in the past, like what their stance might be. If that way you'll know if they're for or against something. and if, or the likelihood that you would be able to sort of use your story or use the stories of the folks that you're with to convince them to kind of um, look into the policies that you're advocating for. All right. So for our day on the Hill, there are a few ways that you can get involved. You can, of course, research, not research, I'm sorry, RSVP for Day on the Hill. You can, give me 1 second. You can sign up to volunteer for Day on the Hill. And if you're interested and you know you might be interested to do this, you can either email me at info@housingforalltn.org or drop it in the chat. But here is kind of some of our information that we have. We're going to have uh, a volunteer information meeting. It's a virtual meeting that's going to happen on December the 4th, and I have that information in the chat as well. And so I thank you so much for having you guys spend some of your evening with me.
I did have a question.
Mhm.
So, I've kind of have talked to some people in the sort of drug policy advocacy space, and one thing that I kind of heard consistently was that there are reps that, like, in public, they're very anti-drug, for example, but kind of when you get them in a closed room, they kind of start to surprise you a little bit. Have you experienced that ever in your own advocacy? Kind of like, or do you think that it tends to follow more so what people's public positions are?
Yeah, I think sometimes when you do have some representatives alone, right, you might be able to get different perspectives on what they say that might be different from in the public. And so sometimes, and this is where, if you're paired with other policy folk or folks that are really sort of knowledgeable about the policymakers, they will be able to say, like, okay, this is what they've said in private, and then see if there's a way that you can encourage them to sort of shift their position, um, regardless of what they say in the public. And this is Tracy. This is just me talking. I'm going to just kind of put my Housing for All Tennessee hat to the side. A lot of times even if you're not in Tennessee, I'll get to that a little bit later, but um, really what is going to matter is what they vote for. So, you know, some folks may say something in public, but if they don't vote for it or they vote against it, that is where it matters. So you really want to track not so much what is said in public, that's really important, but you really want to do research on their voting record. How do they vote? Because that's where the rubber meets the road, if you will. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah. And then if you're not in Tennessee, we try to include information about other states and things of that nature. Also in that, but yeah, you can look up your states or internationally to find out like how the advocacy process works. And I would say, like, wherever you are, you may want to research organizations that are doing the type of advocacy work that you're interested in. So, for example, one of the organizations that's around housing is, give me a second, I think it is the National Alliance on Homelessness. is one, and then there's the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And a lot of these particular organizations do have like state partners and things of that nature. You may also want to look up nonprofits in your area or in your local area that are doing the work that you're interested in. Um, so yeah, so you want to maybe do a little bit of research on your own, and also partner with organizations. And many times, a lot of the advocacy organizations will give you kind of talking points and things of that nature, to kind of help with how do I say these things? Um, how do I, approach a legislator or things of that nature?
I have another question for you. So I've done some advocacy with, I'm in New Mexico and we have the New Mexico Coalition to End Homelessness that does a yearly legislative day. And one of the things that we've run into is that a lot of our legislature is landlords. So like
Mhm.
I think we actually did manage to get a ban on like, or a cap on how much an application fee can cost because they were charging so much money. But things like that where we're advocating to people who not only have a like, oh, my constituents say they want this, but it's individuals who have a vested profit interest in housing policy. What have you found to be good resources to like educate yourself so you can have an informed discussion with those individuals? Since like if it's a landlord, they know oftentimes so much about ho housing that it's like harder to get into as a medical student who knows a lot less about housing, like laws and policy from that side.
Yeah, I mean, this is where it would probably like some of the more advanced like policy folks could give an answer, but a lot of that might be even asking a question like, how do you deal with conflict of interest around that? Um, we know that you're a landlord. How do you negotiate? And that's also kind of pushing for accountability from that, um, particularly when there's like conflicts of interest. And that could be really dicey if you don't have a relationship with that particular legislator. So, like, if you're just meeting them for the first time, that might not necessarily be the first question that you ask. But it's definitely we do run into that, right? Where there are definite conflicts of interest around that, and particularly if you're looking at like their voting record and what they vote for. Um, but also the thing to emphasize is that your constituents are renters, and this is what they've asked for, right? And you represent them. And so um, and some of that is just also finding out. And I might have to do a little bit more research, and I'm going to get some other answers for you as to how we handle that. Because I want to give you a definitive answer and also strategy. So I can put that on my list of like follow up things too.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Hi, I have a question for you.
Mhm.
Um, so advocacy, I feel like can sometimes feel really disheartening because it's such a slow process to see change. And so when there's moments like that, how do you push through it? And like, what advice would you have for advocates who maybe feel a little discouraged with like the slow process of it?
Yeah, I think that that's one of the things that gets, I think, really can also cause a lot of apathy. Like we've been pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. Um, about 2 weeks ago, I was on a panel with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I was asked a similar question. It was around hope. Um, and I would say for me personally, I don't have the luxury to not have hope, but my hope is not woo woo in the sky. It's very practical. I know that this is going to be a marathon, right? You know, we'll have some quick wins. We'll have some things that, oh, we've pushed through. And then you'll have some things where you're just like, this doesn't feel like it's gonna go anywhere, right? But I think it's also important to look to history, and to look through things like the civil rights movement, things like LGBTQIA plus movements, other liberation movements, or other spaces where disability movements, right, where things have been happening for such a long time and there's been such a push. But, you know, we know that there is something that on the other side of that, if we continue to push and we continue to push. Um, um, and also, um, even if they're small wins, celebrate them, because you've earned them, right? Um, and the work that you do and the folks that we serve, that we have the privilege of serving, require us to have stamina, right? They require us to kind of push through. And, you know, I don't know the walks of life that each of you have, but, you know, some of you might have different experiences or lived experiences, some of you might not. Um, but the folks that we serve require kind of us to push through. And I look to those people. I look to the people that I serve as, um, motivation to kind of push through.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Tracy, I have another question. How much digging like should you do on a legislator before you speak with him or her? Like, what kinds of things should you look for that you might have in common?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I would say do as much digging as you have available that's available to the public, right? So things like, oh, you went to this undergrad, you went to this school in undergrad, I went to the same school, right? Because what you're doing is it's building a relationship. And so you got to figure out, because these are people, right? What you might have in common and what you don't. I was talking to someone who uh, they were a legislator. They were working with a legislator, and they found out that that legislator was went to Notre Dame and like really, really just loved Notre Dame. Right, all her kids went, she went, her husband went, and so that's how they connected. They were like, "Oh, we have a legal clinic that we, yeah, go Irish." Like, so we all have a legal clinic there, right? And so they use that tiny window of like what their interests are to be able to like forge a relationship. Um, Definitely find out about their voting record, their positions. Also like, things, knowing if they are a landlord or not. Knowing, what they say in public and what they do in private. Like you're really getting to know people. And the goal is to get to know these people in such a way to where when you speak to them and come with an issue or develop a relationship with them, if possible, some of them you're not going to, because they're going to be just completely the antithesis of all your values, right? Some folks you're just not going to, but it's important to know like who they are and what they stand for, what they believe, how they vote, and even little things like they really like strawberry ice cream, because we're dealing and talking to people.
I just posted in the chat. I actually remember from 2024 that when we did like digging on legislators, we had this like spreadsheet that some of my students helped
Mhm.
out with. So that might be helpful to folks as
Yeah.
they start digging for people in their states.
Yeah, and usually like advocacy organizations that do this kind of work, they usually know, have a lot of information about folks. And also know people who might have more influence. So let's say if you're pushing for a policy that is it that let's say they say one thing in public, but they do something in private. Um, but you may have an ally in your coalition or in your group that has a deeper relationship. You might be able to get that person to, take a look at, have them to sort of persuade them to take a look at the policies and things of that nature, from your perspective.
Thank you so much. I guess I will give it. Anyone else have any more questions?
I had a question. First of all, thank you so much, Tracy, for this great presentation, and thank you for being here. My question is, I'm very new to kind of the advocacy space and trying to learn more. Um, a couple of thoughts that came to mind was, how do I, as a student, part of an
Mhm.
organization or kind of represents, say, like a university, how do I navigate potential kind of pushback from
Mhm.
starting to advocate from, say, that university?
Okay. So some of this is going to be like if you're talking to a legislature that you're going as yourself. Some of it is going to be, how do you navigate, or what I'm hearing the question is like, how do you navigate institutional pushback for the things that, that that you might be advocating for, like organizations. And some of that is also getting, just like legislators, is also getting to know who in the institution that might be pro the things that you're trying to push, who might be against it and why. Um, and really developing relationships to find out how you can move the needle forward. Um, it also can be a really precarious situation, as a student, making sure that you're not, um, that there's like not any retaliation or things of that nature. Um, uh, uh, or things of or that. So also knowing like your grievance processes and things of that nature would be really, really important. And then I got a question, and it says, could you cover an example of your advocacy work? One of the students messaged me about um, a bill you focused on disability rights is great. Okay. So I'm going to, so Allison, did I answer your question?
Yes, thank
Or,
you so much.
okay. Yeah. And so it might just be also finding out, and just doing a little research on finding out like, you know, what, also like the way that I say this is, if there's pushback, what is the fear? What is the reason behind the pushback? And if that reason behind the pushback is something that can be worked through, trying to have as much dialogue with those folks as possible. It's very difficult work, to do this work, especially when it's conflict. Um, so one of my before working for Housing for All Tennessee in a past life, I worked for the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center in a project called Tennessee Disability Pathfinder. And I also worked with the Tennessee Council on Developmental Disabilities. Um, and I'm going to tell you just a very short story about a, a campaign initiative. So prior to working with the Kennedy Center, I also worked as a public policy intern um, with the Tennessee Council on Developmental Disabilities. And one of the issues that we were fighting during this time, and this is like 2000, like early mid 2000s, we were trying to expand the Medicaid waiver and to get people with developmental disabilities who didn't have a diagnosis of intellectual disabilities more home and community based services, so they could stay in their home and have the supports that they need, essentially. Um, and we pushed and pushed and pushed that bill, and it didn't happen for years, right? Um, and a lot of times, what happens with policies is like you come in with the best policy with all of the things that you would want, like your Ferrari level policy, right? Your biggest and highest hopes. And then throughout that process or policy process, some of the things get, taken away, or, some of the things get, you have to, compromise. Some of the things you kind of are dead set and kind of like dig your feet in the ground on. But eventually that policy got passed. There was an expansion. Was it the expansion that folks wanted? No, but there was sort of an expansion. And so that's when I say, like, you really have to think about like the little wins, and then keep pushing for the little wins in the windows that you have. And sometimes there's unexpected things where you're not expecting it to to win, but it does. So this is a work that requires great hope, but also great pragmatism. um, in it. I hope that kind of answers the question. The bill that we were working on, or the campaign we were working on at that time, was called Fulfill the Promise, right? So there was a promise that they would, Tennessee would expand their Medicaid waiver programs to include people with severe developmental disabilities into the Medicaid waiver program. And for years and years and years, it didn't happen until there was a little bit of an expansion after, I think after maybe 8 years of pushing. And it was 8 years of pushing, of not just educating lawmakers, but also educating um, people who had lived experience. And also, some of the advocacy work is educating the general public. Um, and that could be sometimes your most powerful work, is not so much what you do with legislators, but how you can shift and change the hearts and minds of the people that you meet every day, um, and encouraging them to also talk to their legislators or push for things.
Thank you so much, Tracy. This was absolutely wonderful. I know we're in our last 5 minutes. Does anyone have any like final thoughts or questions that they'd like to bring up?